So a huge welcome and thank you to everyone for joining us. This is our first webinar of 2021. I'll kick things off with a short introduction and summary of the session today. I'm Angela Franks and run Frazer Jones in Australia. For those who don't know us, Frazer Jones is a dedicated and specialised recruitment agency in the people and HR space. We're a global business, but we have teams locally in Sydney and Melbourne and service clients all over Australia and New Zealand. So welcome everybody local and abroad for joining. Thank you, I should say, for joining. So this session is focused on reshaping work, and the world's changed a little bit in the past 12 months. So the webinar incorporates a wider discussion around flexible working, returning to the office, public health orders, and the vaccination regime, and what that really means for employers. I was talking to friends at the weekend and they're like, no jab, no job. But I think possibly that phrase is not as straightforward as it sounds. So it's going to be interesting to hear about the complexities of that topic. We'll also discuss some key tax risks. I'll get there in a second. So we've got expat worker relocations, JobKeeper audits, and clawbacks, plus a selection of other related tax risks. So it'll be interesting to hear about those as well. So to that end, we're absolutely delighted to have Cilla Robinson and Agustin with us to take us through these evolving topics. So kicking things off will be Cilla. Cilla's a partner with Clayton's and specialises in workplace relations, employment and safety. Following Cilla, we'll hear from Amber, who's also a partner at Clayton's, specialising in tax. So Cilla and Amber will speak for about 20 minutes each. We've left some discussion time at the end, but having a chat yesterday, more than happy to take questions as we go. So I will monitor the Q&A button as we go, and then sort of interject with any helpful questions that relate to the topic at the time. So everyone joining in the audience is on mute and the videos are off so that we can actually record the session. We do get a lot of feedback that it's great to watch after it if you have to duck off or if you want to catch up on it later. So we'll send that link out in about a week. And then over to you, Cilla.
Great, thanks very much, Angela. So jumping right in. Goodness me, now there we go. As Angela mentioned, I'm doing the HR overview. So I'm an employment lawyer, so focusing on people. And the three main things that I'm going to be talking about today are maintaining a COVID-safe workplace, returning to the traditional workplace, and also the future of flexible work arrangements. Now, I'm conscious that to the HR professionals on the line, a lot of the content that I'll be talking about may be familiar to you or things that you're already thinking about. So as Angela said, by all means, if you have targeted questions, then feel free to jump in and ask them. Amber and I both have quite a lot of content on the screens. Forgive us, we're used to presenting to lawyers who demand a lot of takeaway content on the slides. So we probably will both be working through the content at a relatively decent pace so that we have enough time to have some questions at the end. So moving straight into maintaining a COVID-safe workplace, we've obviously got the overarching concept of the work health and safety laws. We've got an obligation to keep our staff safe so far as reasonably practicable, and to the extent that we can't eliminate risks, then the work health and safety laws require us to take every step to minimise those risks. So that broad work health and safety obligation and duty of care that employers have is probably something that you're all very familiar with. But of course, in a COVID-19 environment, it makes it quite challenging because keeping abreast of the developments in the pandemic, they change day to day, they change state to state. So that means that ensuring that your staff are safe in the workplace, whether that's in the office or from home, becomes increasingly challenging. Now, thankfully in Australia, we've dealt with that immediate risk, touch wood, and we're now thinking about getting people back to the office. So the three things that I wanted to talk about from a work health and safety perspective within the pandemic context is vaccine considerations, complying with public health orders, and then just a little bit about the general government guidance that we've been dealing with as well. So first of all, I wanted to talk about the vaccine considerations, and Angela mentioned the no jab, no job. And from my perspective and from my client's perspective, I wish it was as straightforward as that. Unfortunately, it's not. And the reality is that the overwhelming majority of employers don't actually have the right to mandate vaccination by their staff. So that's the starting point. And quite helpfully, the government has come out and said that. We've been telling that to our staff for quite some time. Finally, the government has also put out a release to that effect, so that this concept that, you know, employers will require all staff to have a vaccine just doesn't fly anymore, subject to the industry that you're in and the work that is done by the company. So essentially, it's a standard lawyer line. You need to think about it on a case-by-case basis from an employer perspective, from a company perspective, but also there will be specific circumstances with respect to individual employees that will need to be considered as well. So the first box we have here on the slide is voluntary versus mandatory. As I said, most companies won't have an ability to mandate vaccine, and there are some exceptions to that though. So employees who interact with people, with a large amount of people, for example, airport workers, airline workers, there will be a reasonable basis for organisations and companies like that to mandate vaccines. Similarly, employees who come into close contact with vulnerable customers or patients and the like, people who have health concerns, that's another context where, of course, mandating a vaccine will be legitimate. So really, we're talking about airlines, we're talking about airport workers, we're talking about health and aged care workers, and people who otherwise come into contact with a lot of people. So, you know, people working, for example, at a big stadium are probably going to be put in that bucket, notwithstanding the fact that they're not health workers, etc. So unless you're in one of those few buckets, you don't have the ability to mandate. So what are companies doing to try and ensure that most of their staff get a vaccine? A lot of our clients are starting to talk to us about how can we incentivize staff to have the vaccine. So can't mandate it, let's incentivize it. So what those incentives looks like will vary from company to company. And, you know, whether it might be a bonus, whether it might be some kind of, you know, collateral that they'll be given. These are things that Aussie companies are currently considering while we wait for the vaccine to be available. But it's not just employees that are being incentivised. We're also seeing, of course, customers being incentivised to help minimise the risk to companies' employees. So, for example, making a vaccine a condition of international travel or entry to premises. So it's an interesting situation where companies are potentially mandating a vaccine for their customers in order to actually access their services. Now, there are legitimate reasons to refuse a vaccine. And I mean, never before in my now what is 20-year career as an employment lawyer have I had cause to talk to my clients about conspiracy theorists, but here we are. So I believe that COVID exists, and I'm hopeful that the vaccine works, but many people, not just in America, question those two things as fact. So being a conspiracy theorist and thinking that COVID doesn't exist isn't going to be a legitimate basis to refuse getting a vaccination. However, having legitimate medical reasons or having reasons by way of discrimination laws in terms of protections that exist, they might be a legitimate basis by which an employee can push back. Now, I said that comment about conspiracy theorists in the context of a discussion that I was having with Fiji Airways last week, and they said that they would happily allow me to talk about that fact, where they are having air stewards saying they don't believe in COVID, they don't believe in the vaccine, they're not going to do it, and they're saying, you know, we really need staff to get on board with this. So, you know, there may be legitimate medical reasons, and you do need to consider whether somebody's health condition or any other protected attribute, or of course religious reasons, means that a vaccine and mandating a vaccine might actually be contrary to other employment laws And it really is primarily discrimination laws that we're concerned about. So you need to get employees' views if you're not in that mandated context that's going to be legitimate. But then you also need to have a think about how you're asking those questions. And that's when we merge into some privacy law considerations, because of course, whether someone's had a vaccine or not is health data, and an employer mustn't collect information.
I think Cilla's frozen. Amber, is she frozen for you? Yeah. Poor Cilla.
Then for a moment.
There we go. Yeah, you're back.
Okay.
Cilla, sorry, we lost you.
Goodness me, my apologies. I'm not quite sure what happened then. I just carried on talking. But I was talking
we got past. Oh yeah, you remember where you're at. Yeah. Okay. Cool.
Well, I was starting to talk about the privacy laws, and we had quite a lot of clients in Asia, in particular, who were wanting to test their staff in terms of temperature testing and the like on access to the building, and they were wanting to send that data back to head office, and we just had to inform them that it's private information. You need to get permission from staff to actually hold that information. So that is another consideration from a privacy perspective if you're thinking about asking questions. I just wanted to check, I've just see a message there that we've lost visibility of the slides.
Yeah, I was just about to tell you that, Cilla. Yeah, we can't see the slides.
Let me see.
Thanks, Margaret.
Thank you.
Yeah. My Frazer James contingent just told me.
We can see that there now? Yep. Excellent.
Yep, that's it.
Okay, great. My apologies. All right, so that's essentially just the privacy law considerations that we need to also think about in considering whether or not we can talk about mandating the vaccine for our staff. So, of course, in addition to vaccine considerations, we've got the public health orders and the government guidance that we need to have regard to. So in Australia, we're fortunate that hopefully we're through the worst of it. Importantly, from an employer perspective and from an HR perspective, the public health order in New South Wales, for example, was until December that employers must allow staff to work from home if they can. So up until December this year, you actually couldn't require an employee to come back to work. You couldn't mandate it. It would have been contrary to Gladys's public health order. That has now changed. So there is an ability to require people to come back to the office, in order to, get people to start, working in a more traditional, normal way, as we get ready for the rollout of the vaccine. So, nothing to prevent you from getting people back into the office at the moment. But again, you need to consider whether your workplace is, if you're a gym or a nail bar and all those kind of places that still have some limitations, then you obviously need to have regard to the public health orders. But similarly, notwithstanding the fact that you can start directing staff to come back, you also need to have regard to the individual employee. So if somebody is, for example, requiring a 1.5 hour or 1 hour train ride and they have an immunosuppressed relative at home, then that would be a legitimate basis for an employer to say, hey, I'm not quite ready to come back to the office. And unfortunately, that means that you need to deal with those kind of pushback comments from staff on a case-by-case basis, because the order to, the direction to come back to work does need to be a lawful and reasonable direction. It will now be a lawful direction, but the question will be, is it reasonable? And that'll depend on the specific circumstances. So in addition to public health orders, we've got the government guidance. Now, most large employers have had pandemic policies in place since SARS. Some smaller organisations, had to then pivot and work out what their pandemic policy was once COVID, really was impacting Aussie employees. So most of you will be familiar with the government guidance. I won't go through it in any detail, but essentially it talks to employees having the right to a safe workplace, that COVID is a unique situation that means that both employers and their staff and contractors need to have regard to keeping themselves safe in the workplace. There needs to be consultation with staff. And essentially it's requiring that there is a shared duty of staff and companies to ensure that they are safe, hygienic practices in the workplace, and that any instances of COVID are dealt with appropriately, that social distancing and physical distancing is maintained in the office and the like. So I'm sure most of you have been dealing with this already, so I won't go into any more detail on the government guidance, because those 10 principles haven't actually changed. So the big question, yes.
Do you mind if I just quickly interrupt with a question? Just somebody's asked, is there a guideline around the travel time for flexible work arrangements? So is 90 minutes one way reasonable as a minimum? Just coming, because you obviously mentioned that they live far away or whatever the situation is.
There's not.
Okay.
Unfortunately, what is going to be reasonable is going to be a case-by-case basis. So there's not a sort of arbitrary figure like that. So it would be helpful. The government won't do something like that because it kind of cuts across the common law position about lawful and reasonable direction. So alas, no cheat sheet in that regard, I'm afraid. And look, I mean, we've got people wearing masks on public transport and all these kind of things. So somebody saying I've got a long train ride isn't going to be enough. It needs to be I've got a long train ride, coupled with a husband who has cancer at home, or a parent or something like that, so that you're getting both public transport plus a higher risk relative in their own workplace, home. So moving to the question of returning to the traditional workplace. So when will we be normal again? Do we even want to return to the old normal is a question that many of my clients and their staff are considering. So in terms of the considerations, I've mentioned the public health orders already. We don't have this, requirement that staff have to be able to work from home if they can. We've got the government guidance, as I mentioned, so all companies need to have a COVID safety plan. There does need to be some options in terms of ensuring that there's a safe and clean workplace and the like. So these things have been in place for some time, but in terms of what organisations are doing to really facilitate that, the one that we're seeing most is staggered start times. Now, it kind of feels a little bit weird in terms of staggered start times, but an example, for example, is our building, Clayton Utes. We're in a big office high rise in the city. Most people have offices. We don't have any issue with having social distancing in terms of where people are sitting within the workplace. However, there's 6 lifts to get up. And if we have all of our staff, in the foyer at 9 a.m., we're going to have serious issues in terms of social distancing. So really having to think through the practicalities of egress, access and exits from the building means that companies are having these staggered start times as an easy way to control that. And I'll come back to some of the other things that are being adopted to sort of manage people being in the workplace shortly. But moving on to managing the transition rather back to the workplace, the most important thing is that staff feel safe. In terms of your work health and safety obligations, it's not just about keeping people physically safe. There is an obligation to keep people psychologically safe as well. So people need to feel safe to come back to the workplace. They need to feel that it is a safe environment. So you need to obviously accommodate social distancing guidelines. You need to be engaging with staff so that they understand what's expected. Early communication is key, and consultation might be appropriate with certain teams who work in different ways. And again, as HR professionals, these things aren't going to be any kind of newsflash to you. It's just best practice HR. But when people are actually worried about their health or the health of their relatives and family, it does really up the ante for how stressed they might be feeling about coming back to work. So it's a little bit of a novel territory for most of us to deal with. Now, offices that have, hotspots and don't have dedicated offices, some of them are just putting it in the too hard basket. Most of our clients that are US-based companies are just saying no one's back in the office until June at the earliest, and just sort of saying, look, we have hotspots, we're going to keep people at home for as long as possible. Now that's fine for the senior staff who all have dedicated offices and a nice place to work. A little bit different for maybe the junior staff who are working on the kitchen bench and would actually prefer to be back into the office. So again, it's one of those things that you really need to consider what's going to be best for the company, but also have regard to what is going to work for the employees as well. Now, most companies have said that they're encouraging rather than directing staff back, which I think is the appropriate thing to do. I think the AFR announced that of the ASX top 100, 24 out of 25 would allow staff to work from home. In this year, most of them are just going to be encouraging, and most of these companies are also saying that they're going to really consider flexible work options moving forward. So in terms of what to do if an employee refuses to return to the workplace, then you need to consider, is it an appropriate direction to direct people back? Now, in Australia, where we've got, in most states, low to zero community transmission, then that direction to come back into the workplace will likely be reasonable. And then again, you'll have to consider whether refusal of that person leads you into territory where they want a flexible work arrangement, which I'll talk about shortly. But we do now have clients who are starting to discipline staff where they're refusing to come back into the workplace where there's no legitimate basis for them to refuse to do so. So it's interesting territory that we're entering. Now, this slide, I just wanted to, again, mention very briefly some of the options that organisations are considering to manage those health risks, but also get people back to the office. So we're seeing split rosters and days of work in the office. We're seeing organisations managing that risk of, a second wave or subsequent waves, or in our case, hotel quarantine debacles, by just having quite a softly approach in terms of getting people back. Organisations are integrating social distancing and viral hazards into just their normal ways of working. So they're just adopting a COVID-safe plan, notwithstanding the fact that maybe there's not a public health order that requires it. And they're also, of course, acknowledging the mental health impact and the requirement to ensure that people are feeling okay about getting back into the workplace. So, it's been challenging having a remote workforce. So again, people need to understand that getting people back into the office is a stressor for many people, and to take that on board. Now, in terms of the impacts on flexible work practices, I've got this example. Law is so traditional, and even our profession managed to pivot relatively quickly into remote working. So the ongoing impact of the pandemic on work from home arrangements and flexible work practices has been great. There's been a real erosion of stigma, which for people like myself who are pro flexibility are very happy to see. We've seen a challenge to the old school sort of mentality that if people were not in the office and they weren't working. We've seen, demonstrated levels of productivity, so that there's been a real pushback on this concept that, if people are at home, then they're not really working properly. And of course, we've also seen real efficiencies in terms of, all of the online platforms like this one, allowing people to work in ways that are a lot more flexible, that will, I've got no doubt, endure beyond the pandemic. Our clients are increasingly wanting to catch up with us by video instead of coming into the office, notwithstanding the fact that, they like to have a nice coffee and a biscuit and when they come in, but it's much more efficient and timely for them to just do it from their office. So essentially, we are seeing that change. We're seeing leverage of technology, which is really helpful. In terms of the future of flexible working arrangements, I've mentioned the work health and safety considerations. They obviously apply if people are working from home as well. So, if you are going to have staff that are having ongoing flexible work arrangements, then if you don't already have work from home plans and surveys to ensure that people are actually working safely if they're working from their home environment, then you really need to get on board ASAP to do that. Similarly, turn your mind to how we're ensuring that people's mental health is okay when they're working from home, because they're not getting that day-to-day interaction with colleagues. They might be feeling a little bit more isolated. You're not having the ability to do those "are you okay" check-ins to make sure that your team is traveling well. So these are considerations that are sort of front and center of the HR professionals and employment lawyers that we're working with. One of the things that you've probably read about is the issue of DV in a work from home environment. So we had all these people during lockdown and the like who were suddenly at home with abusive partners, and that was then a problem that became a workplace problem to a degree that was higher than normal. So again, if somebody's wanting to work from home, or if you're mandating that people stay home, you need to have regard to people's rights with respect to domestic violence leave and the like, and also just mandating something that might be creating a real risk to your employees' health and safety. So in terms of ongoing flexible work arrangements, then there is an ability under the law, if you have more than 12 months service, to request a flexible work arrangement from your employer. So this isn't a new concept, that's always been there. But historically, employers have the ability to push back on that request for legitimate business reasons. Now, what the pandemic has done is mean that all of these employees are working from home. So a business's ability to push back on legitimate business grounds has really disappeared if someone's been working from home quite effectively during the pandemic. So many clients are sort of saying, can we push back? And the answer to most of them is no, if the person's been doing their job quite effectively. So my clients, my firm itself, are expecting that moving forward, most employees will want at least 1 or 2 days from home, and acknowledging there's probably not going to be a basis to push back on that if the employer was inclined to want to push back on that. Now, I've got part-time options on the screen. Just to mention very briefly that the JobKeeper stand-down provisions did a really interesting thing in terms of employment law in Australia, and because it essentially allowed this secondary employment concept, which we didn't really grapple with in Australian employment law prior to the pandemic. So what we have seen is for part-time employees, many employers are allowing their staff to have multiple jobs, potentially for companies that may traditionally have been seen to be in competition, to allow their employees to have an additional income stream. Now, finally, I just wanted to say that, as an employment lawyer, we've historically always talked about work-life balance. Now it really is becoming work-life blend. That's the reality of what we're doing. Amber and I are both appearing from our homes today, notwithstanding the fact that we're back in the office as well. And I think, as HR professionals, that is kind of the new lingo that we're talking about. And it becomes much harder, your job, to actually manage those risks, work with your, with your business stakeholders to grapple with all of these changes, which really sit within your remit of responsibility. So second last slide, I'm conscious that I'm talking quickly, but I want to make sure we've got enough time for questions and Amber's tax content. So some of the challenges of the post-pandemic world is the expectation gap between employees and employers. So Boston Consulting Group did a survey of 200 Australian companies last September, and it found that 63% of employees want a hybrid model moving forward that allows them to work from home. And employers say that they think that working from home arrangements will only be available to about 40%. So there's a disconnect there from the outset. And I think sophisticated employers are realizing that the ability to work from home, the ability to have that flexibility is going to be critical to attracting and retaining talent. But now we're really seeing it front and center, irrespective of seniority, where quite junior staff are saying, if I can't work from home, I don't want the job. So whether businesses want it or not, they really have to get with the program, because not having flexibility in the way that we've had it during the pandemic as a go-forward position will actually limit their ability to attract and retain talent, which again is going to be impacting on your ability to do your work as HR professionals. Now, the other thing that's right in your remit is managing a hybrid workforce. It's all well and good to say we want flexibility and get flexibility, but you have to acknowledge that having some staff at home and some staff in the office is actually harder, notwithstanding that we have the technology to assist, and that there is quite a lot of research now that suggests that managers find it very hard to treat staff equally when you've got some at home and some in the office, and generally being that if the manager's in the office, then they will prefer to give the work to those who are in the office as well. So proactively talking to your business stakeholders about these things so that you don't have these issues arising will be really important. And of course, there's the cost benefit analysis. I mentioned productivity. A lot of that has been turned on its head in terms of the assumption that if you're at home, you're bludging. Some jobs are much more easy to assess whether somebody's working or not. Amber and my teams have a timesheet where we can see their time. It's much harder in some organisations to assess whether people are really working or not when they're at home. But some of the costs are less supervision, issues with mental health, some blurring of boundaries with work and their home life, and then of course equipment constraints where you're having to have two offices, one in the office and one at home. So there's lots of benefits in terms of people's well-being and the like, and having that flexibility, but there are also some costs as well. So finding that balance is really important. And then you've got the practical considerations where you've got a building that you're paying multi-millions of dollars for and it's only 50% full. What then happens to those office buildings when we move to this more flexible arrangement moving forward? So finally, I just wanted to leave you with this slide, which talks about some of the risks and management strategies of just dealing with constant change. And I think we all know in this space that the impact of the pandemic has been significant in terms of people's well-being. And so, whilst we're dealing with the practical side of things from the company's perspective of managing that change, pivoting and dealing with all of the work health and safety risks, employees are having to deal with that constant change as well. And that can lead to disengagement, morale issues, loss of trust if things aren't being done in a transparent way. And of course, all of that can lead to stress claims and loss of talent. So these management strategies, again, will be probably motherhood statement for you guys. However, being in the trenches, showing that you care, showing some vulnerability and communication, these are really things that you need to tool up your business stakeholders about, and also just things like showing some gratitude if people are working hard, and allowing staff to sort of understand that they can focus on what's within their control and just have to sort of let go in terms of what is beyond their control, because all of us are dealing with challenging times that we haven't had to endure before. So I'm going to hand over now for the tax fund, and if there's any questions, we can revisit them at the end. Thanks.
I might just jump in, Amber, while you get the slides ready, if that's okay. Thanks so much, Cilla. I actually ran a poll a couple of weeks ago on working patterns, just on LinkedIn. I think I might have had about 300 people do it, so I need to check it. But the majority said that they would be that they're working either 2-3 or 3-2, that combo. I guess the next question is that because they want to, or is that because that's what the organisation's agreed at this moment in time? And then what does that look like in 6 or 12 months? I think the other question that we're going to maybe try and tie into a salary survey that we're going to launch soon is, would people be willing to move jobs but stay on the same salary, or maybe even accept slightly less if that means they've got the flexibility? So because these are issues from a HR and talent perspective, because obviously a lot of people are money motivated, but that's not moving forward. People have seen the benefits, and maybe even not traveling could be a financial benefit from a timing perspective.
100%.
Children and pickups and all this kind of stuff. So it's going to get a bit messy. So we're going to
it's already so messy. We've got clients that have had people working from home from other states, people who have had a tree or a sea change, and quite understandably, they don't now want to have to move back to Sydney. And they say they've been doing their job effectively from, Byron or wherever it might be. So there's all manner of pain coming towards the HR professionals and employment lawyers in dealing with all of this. There's no doubt. But I think we're as a firm, we're talking with the
Mhm.
other top tier firms about these issues, because we know it's going to be an issue where at the moment, the mid-tier firms are dealing with that flexibility and providing a lot more flexibility for people to work from Newcastle or other places. And we're identifying it already as an issue in terms of talent retention.
And that was actually going to be one of my questions. I was going to ask it, but I'll quickly do it now. So yeah, have you had clients where their staff have just literally moved away and not told anyone?
Yeah.
So what do they do?
Or moved away. We had one where the person was from Victoria. They moved, their wife got a job in Canberra and they don't want to move back to Victoria now. And the client's like, what can I do? We're back in the office and we're having to then grapple through, well, can the person do it remotely? Is there a legitimate business reason? And in addition to that, you absolutely had lots of people who moved to the Central Coast and did a bunch of different things, changed schools. And now there's all these awkward discussions where unless they have not been doing their job, or unless their job really requires them to be in the office, the business has to give genuine consideration, notwithstanding it being a pain in their ass, to whether it can carry on, forever. So it's a really interesting dynamic.
I love your technical phrases, Cilla. They very refreshing. Just a couple of quick questions from the in the chat. So yeah, the recording and the slides will be made available. That's no problem. And then I'm just conscious that Amber needs to talk. So why don't I come back to these questions at the end? We'll let Amber.
Good idea.
It's about tax. Yay.
Thanks, Cilla. Thanks, Angela. So I'd love to have some good news from a tax and superannuation perspective. I have no good news at all to share with you, but I do think there are some big risks and there are some significant developments in this space, emerging primarily out of the pandemic, but also just a couple of things that have been happening in the background that are unrelated to the pandemic, but are significant, that I'll share with you. I'm very mindful of time. I do want to make sure we've got time at the end for questions. I expect there are a few questions. So what I might do is just flag that there's quite a bit of detail on the slides. I believe that that Angela will be able to make the slides available. So what we might do is whip through some of the slides. I won't touch on all the content. There's some content there. And I'll just focus on rather some of the perhaps more significant aspects. Anyone who wants to sort of find out about the detail on the payroll tax issues, the FBT issues, the nitty-gritty on the PAYG withholding, maybe in the first instance, check the slides. There's some detail in there that will assist. But I think what we might have time to touch on are a couple of bigger risks. So business level tax risks. So in the context that businesses are finding themselves with displaced and remote working arrangements for workers, businesses should be, sorry, Cilla, we'll just flip over to the first slide if we could. So Cilla's very kindly agreed to drive the slides because of the real risk that I would stuff it all up. Fantastic. Thank you very much. Thanks, Cilla. So businesses need to be aware that where they've got workers who are displaced or moving around, or in an international sense, not working in their usual jurisdictions, they may be triggering either additional Australian taxation obligations or indeed international taxation obligations. So the ATO has been a little bit tolerant about this, but that accommodation has pretty much run out. It's interesting because I don't think no one thinks this is over. No one's expecting that we're going back to normal arrangements. The borders are still largely closed, and yet certainly the ATO and a number of international tax regulators have started to signal to employers that they're expecting that employers will be meeting taxation obligations that may be triggered by the having of employees working in jurisdictions where they would not ordinarily work. So we probably don't have time to go into that in too much detail, but I will just flag that if you have workers who are not in their home jurisdiction, not in the jurisdiction that they would be in but for the pandemic, the business needs to be aware that it's very likely that that employee personally is needing to deal with additional and different income tax obligations, and that is likely to have a knock-on effect for the business. The other broad business level risk that I do want to talk to is what's called a permanent establishment risk. So Cilla, are you able to click through for me, please? Mate, click through this one if you don't mind, and on to the next one. Lovely, thank you so much. So the concept of permanent establishment basically means that if an overseas business has got employees or finds itself with employees unexpectedly working in Australia, whether that's because they were expats, they were overseas, they came home when the government was signalling that Australians needed to come home last year and before the borders closed, or indeed since the borders closed. So overseas businesses that find themselves with workers unexpectedly in Australia may be contributing to a risk that they will find themselves unexpectedly caught in the Australian tax net. That we refer to as permanent establishment risk. It is a very significant tax risk. It creates a significant risk for businesses that they're going to find themselves exposed to taxation by the ATO, where they would not have expected to be taxed by the ATO. For Australian businesses, be aware that the converse is also true. If Australian businesses find themselves with workers who have been caught in overseas jurisdictions, we certainly, anecdotally, just working with some of our clients, we know they've got workers who've unexpectedly been caught in overseas jurisdictions and can't get home. That those Australian businesses need to be aware that they might be exposed to taxation in a foreign jurisdiction, as well as all of their domestic Australian taxation obligations. So look, this all sounds quite scary, and it is. The number one thing I would say though is, as HR professionals, if your business has got employees that find themselves sort of in the wrong jurisdiction, or the jurisdiction that they would not ordinarily be working in, that is absolutely a question to go and talk to your legal and tax advisors about. It generally won't be enough just if there are employees in the wrong jurisdiction. But combined with other factors, it can be enough that the business is going to find itself exposed to a whole additional level of taxation in another jurisdiction that the business was never expecting to be taxed in. The OECD is very aware of this risk and was advising its member states last year to take a very accommodating approach on this, recognising that people were just caught in the wrong jurisdiction. But the ATO came out about 4 weeks ago and said that basically you've got till the end of the financial year, so you've got till 30 June, and the ATO until that point is probably not going to be looking very closely at where your workers are and whether that means there's an exposure to additional taxation. But come 1 July, even though we're not expecting the pandemic to be over, and we're not necessarily expecting to be having the ability to return workers to their correct jurisdictions, come 1 July, it is something that the ATO is going to be looking at. I just saw a question pop up there in the chat. I don't know that I got the full question, but I think someone is asking whether there are agreements between jurisdictions that deal with this risk. Angela, was that the question?
Yeah, it says, are there any agreements being made between countries being more open to this being a much greater reality in the future? Yeah. Are there any agreements?
Look, that is a really, really great question. So there's two answers. So you've got the situation where you have Australia and another country where there is no tax treaty, no double tax agreement. And then you've got the situation where you have Australia and another country with whom we do have a double tax treaty. Fundamentally, this concept of permanent establishment really deals with the relationship between Australia and a country with whom we do have a double tax agreement. So that's the context where we're talking about permanent establishments, because Australia and those other jurisdictions have agreed that as between them, this is how they'll sort of share out the right to tax. And that's where the concept of permanent establishment really comes from, that Australia and other countries say, well, if a business which is overseas has a permanent establishment in Australia and having workers in this jurisdiction helps establish that, then the treaty says if you've got a permanent establishment, Australia and the other country, we agree you can tax that business in Australia. And the converse is true as well. So in fact, yes, there are agreements, but those agreements go to supporting the taxation of permanent establishments. And it's the OECD that was saying to its member states, look, just hold off for now, because obviously the pandemic, but our ATO is saying, okay, that's fine, but come 1 July, this is something we're going to start looking at. So Cilla, would you mind just clicking through for me? I think we might skip over a bit of this material. I'm very mindful of time. If we could get
Amber,
to our
superannuation we're probably okay
slides.
for time. I think, I don't know about we could probably go a little bit over if your diary allows.
Oh, okay. Yeah. All right. Fantastic. Well, look, what I might do then is I'm just going to briefly mention then PAYG withholding obligations. I don't know whether we've gone past that or whether we're yet to come to that one. But oh, thanks, Cilla. Cilla's hunting down that slide for us. So another significant tax issue to be aware of for employers, both Australian employers but foreign employers as well, is that if you find yourself with employees in Australia, oh, thanks, Cilla. If you find yourself with employees in Australia, you need to be dealing with the obligation to meet your PAYG withholding obligations under the tax legislation. So the two key things from a tax perspective arise where a foreign employer has workers in Australia, PAYG withholding, and also superannuation. Unfortunately, the test for deciding whether you have to withhold PAYG and whether you have to pay superannuation are not actually the same. So it is more likely that you will have to pay superannuation guarantee, and there's a slightly higher bar for whether you have to pay PAYG withholding. But fundamentally, if you have a worker who is an Australian tax resident, so an Australian resident for tax purposes, you probably should be undertaking PAYG withholding. What that means is either somebody who's been in the country for 183 days in an income year, or alternatively somebody who's for whom all of the factors evidence that they really are a resident of Australia. So their family is here, they've got permanent accommodations here, and they've got ties into the community here. They're all indicia that the worker is an Australian resident, and that's a big signal to an employer that they must be meeting their PAYG withholding obligations. So the ATO has as well, interestingly, last year signalled that this was something that they're going to start to look at. It was interesting that this was something that they were signalling during the pandemic. Around a number of issues, the ATO was prepared to be quite accommodating, and we're only starting to see the ATO get back onto a normal footing now. But on this issue, the ATO moved quite quickly, and in the middle of last year, message to employers that they need to make sure that they're fulfilling their PAYG obligations. And that includes, obviously, where you've got workers who would ordinarily be abroad but are not and are in the jurisdiction. If there's any doubt about whether or not there are PAYG obligations, then you can actually consult with the ATO about it. Alternatively, you could speak to someone in your tax or legal functions who'll be able to give you guidance. But our expectation is this is an issue that the ATO will be looking at quite closely. As far as the ATO is concerned, the issues that are very, very dear to the ATO's heart include superannuation guarantee obligations and PAYG withholding obligations. The ATO really does take very, very seriously tax and superannuation obligations of taxpayer employers. I wanted to speak briefly as well to something that is not related to COVID, but is something that's happened during the pandemic. And this is in relation to whether or not workers and contractors, so employees and deemed employees, have a right to directly recover unpaid superannuation guarantee themselves. There's a category of, oh, thank you, Cilla. There's a category of workers who do not have a separate contractual or instrument-based right of superannuation. So obviously for many workers, they have a contract, or deemed employees have a contract, or workers who work under an instrument will have an express right to receive superannuation under one of those documents. So this doesn't apply to those categories of workers. This applies to the categories of workers that don't have an express contractual right to receive super. So these are workers who are falling back on the government's superannuation guarantee scheme. The received wisdom has always been that because superannuation guarantee is part of the tax system, that's where Parliament chose to put this obligation effectively, to make it work, to make it constitutional, actually was why it was dealt with this way. Because government chose to make the superannuation guarantee legislation part of the tax system, the received wisdom has always been that only the Commissioner of Taxation had the authority to compel the payment of superannuation. How superannuation guarantee works effectively is, of course, the employer makes a superannuation payment to a superannuation fund. But that is not how superannuation guarantee works. Superannuation guarantee works by saying that all employers will face a tax, which is called the superannuation guarantee charge. And that tax is calculated at 9.5% of ordinary time earnings. And that if the employer goes ahead and makes a direct contribution to the employee's super fund before the super guarantee is due to the ATO, that offsets the tax. So effectively, in practical terms, no one ever ends up paying the tax because the tax gets reduced down to zero. It matches the payment that is made for the benefit of the employee. However, in cases where an employee hasn't paid the superannuation, that's when the tax issues start to come into play. Now, what happened in the Moffat case? So Dr. Moffat was a dentist who had run his own practice. Dental Corp came along and entered into a contract with Dr. Moffat whereby Dental Corp took over the dental practice, but there was a contract under which Dr. Moffat was going to, and did in fact, continue to work in the practice and provided dental services, but also practice management services, supervision and that kind of thing. There were also other staff that he delegated some of those duties to, and other staff who provided a lot of those management services under the contract. So the question arose in this litigation between Dr. Moffat and Dental Corporation, and the ATO was not a party to this litigation. The question arose whether Dr. Moffat was a deemed employee for the purposes of the superannuation guarantee legislation. And the federal court made a declaration to say, we find that Dr. Moffat was an employee for the purposes of the Superannuation Guarantee Administration Act. Now, this was a very, very significant outcome, because up until this point in time, as I've flagged, the understanding, the general received wisdom was, and this is something that certainly there's been a lot of political commentary on, the idea that employees and workers are not able to go and recover their own superannuation if it's unpaid. So the received wisdom has been, this should not have been possible. There was an appeal. There was a request for a special leave application to the High Court, and the High Court refused that special leave application. So what we're left with in this space is a potential pathway for direct recovery of unpaid superannuation guarantee by employees and contractors who are deemed employees who have previously been reliant on the ATO to try to recover unpaid super. This may be opening a pathway for those workers to directly go and recover the superannuation themselves. What we don't yet know is whether, coming off the back of this case, whether Dental Corporation will pay the superannuation, because there was no order made that they pay the superannuation. The court didn't go that far. And what's also unknown is whether the ATO will intervene and try to recover the superannuation, because the ATO was not a party to the litigation, and the orders made by the federal court don't bind the ATO. They don't compel the Commissioner of Taxation to do anything. What we are hearing anecdotally in this space is that there's a lot of thought being given to representative actions and class actions by groups of employees and workers to run similar proceedings to seek declaratory relief, to try to compel the Commissioner to take action to recover superannuation on their behalf. So this is really an emerging issue. The special leave application was only turned down by the High Court on the 11th of February. So it's much too soon to say where this issue is going to go, but it's certainly something that we need to be watching very closely. I think the last thing that I might talk to, Cilla, is the slide about the superannuation guarantee amnesty, and then I might wrap up my comments there. Yeah, perfect. Thank you so much.
We've had a couple of questions come through, I think, related to that topic you were just on. Do you want me to ask them now or at the end?
Oh, sure. Yeah, no, please, Angela, that's great.
Just really, yeah, so I'll ask both of them because you might be able to tie them together. What's the ATO stance? Sorry, this is from Kate. Thank you, Kate. What's the ATO stance when employees have refused to share details enabling employers to make payments of super, e.g. TFN, presumably because they are concerned about possible flag to the ATO about their personal tax residency? So, yeah, so the question is, what's the ATO stance? Yeah, and then the second one was why the ATO try to cross information with Fair Work Ombudsman to enforce inspection. So simple. I'm not sure. Sorry, I don't know if it's a question or a statement. But okay. Anyway,
I think they mean why don't they? I've just written an answer, which is my view.
Yeah. So thank you, Cilla.
Okay. But look, as to the first question, yeah, so I think there's really two answers there, and certainly we've seen this ourselves. The first option is that employers need to have a default fund, a default super fund, so that pardon me, when you provide the choice of fund documentation to employees or somebody who is a contractor but you think is a deemed employee, when you provide the choice of fund documentation and someone refuses to give it back because they say no, I don't want super, I'm not, you're not required to pay me super for their own reasons, you will always have or you're required to have a default fund. So which is a fund into which you put the contributions for the benefit of that individual in default of them nominating a choice of fund to you, the employer. So there's always that that pathway. Why that's a good pathway is that it lets you make the contribution before the contribution becomes overdue. And a contribution before a contribution becomes overdue is always a lesser amount because it doesn't have, your nominal interest on it. It doesn't have your admin charge on it. And also you're not exposed to a risk of penalty. So there's your default fund option. But the other option is where perhaps the conversation's gone on to the point where the contribution is now late, then that really becomes the ATO's problem. So what you do in that case is there's a particular form you fill out, you lodge it with the ATO, and it just includes a number of details. You do not have to provide the TFN to the ATO. It's interesting, ATO officers, your frontline officers will often say, oh, no, you have to give us the TFN. You can't fill out the form without the TFN. That is actually not at all correct. You absolutely can fill out the form without the TFN. You just need to give them as much information as you can, as much identifying information as you can about the individual. Then that becomes the ATO's responsibility to reunite that contribution with the individual. But once you've paid the ATO as the employer, your responsibility is fully fulfilled. So there's nothing in the superannuation guarantee legislation that allows except for very high income earners, and we can talk about that, but that allows a person to refuse, superannuation. it is the employer's obligation to pay it, full stop. Now, the tiny exception to that is that there is a category, and this is sort of relatively new legislation, there is a category of higher income earners who have multiple jobs. So, for example, maybe someone is a professional here and is also an executive on a board over there. They can give up the superannuation guarantee component on one of those roles. If they elect to do that, they've got to put in the election to the ATO. There's a whole process around it. But that's really the only way that a person who's entitled to superannuation guarantee can give it up. Otherwise, it sort of doesn't matter that the person doesn't want it. It's the employer's obligation to pay it one way or another. And then it's not there. There's no exposure for them from that point on. So I hope that I hope that answers that question.
Thanks, Amber.
So the last thing I just wanted to talk to briefly was that there was a legislated unpaid superannuation guarantee amnesty last year, and that ended on 7 September. And under the amnesty, the idea was to encourage employers that might have historical unpaid superannuation guarantee to do a self-audit, find that, quantify that, and come forward to the ATO. And look, and that amnesty did recognise that this is a very complex area of law, and that it is genuinely the case that things change, things can be missed. There can be genuine disagreements as to whether someone is a deemed employee or not. So there was an encouragement here to go back, have a look. If you've got a problem, fix it up. There were some incentives around it, and it was a very, very successful program. The amnesty's over though. One of the quid pro quos, if you like, of getting that legislation through seemed to be that if an employer did not take up the amnesty and disclose unpaid historical superannuation guarantee amounts during the amnesty, and the ATO later, discovers it, or an employee makes a complaint or something of that nature happens, that employer is going to be subject to an automatic 100% penalty on the unpaid superannuation guarantee, because the thinking is, well, you had an amnesty, you should have come forward, you didn't, 100% penalty for you. The effect of that is that it will at least double the amount of the liability. That's the effect of the minimum 100% penalty, and that's a minimum. The maximum penalty can be in the range of 295%. I've certainly never seen a 295% penalty myself, but we are now starting to see penalties come through over 100% for businesses that didn't disclose when they had a chance to do it during the amnesty. Now, the carve out to this is if businesses undertake a self-audit and self-disclose to the Commissioner before the Commissioner comes to you or commences an audit, you can still proceed without automatic exposure to the 100% penalty. So there is still that pathway. So I would say that for businesses who haven't undertaken a superannuation guarantee compliance self-audit, now is the time to do it. What we can say from our work is that the ATO is actively looking for superannuation guarantee non-compliance, and that the ATO is using its big data matching programs to try to find businesses that have not met their superannuation guarantee obligations, and we're starting to see a lot more activity in this space. So what's required to avoid the mandatory minimum 100% penalty here is conduct your own internal audit, and if you even think there could be a problem, you self-notify, you voluntarily notify to the ATO that you're undertaking an audit, and if you find a problem, you will be remediating it. And that puts in very strong protections against the mandatory minimum 100% penalty. And just one final piece of context about how significant superannuation guarantee risk is. This is one of the few areas of tax where the Commissioner has the power to make the liability a personal liability on the directors of the company. For most areas of taxation, that can't happen. The tax just stays in the entity who is the taxpayer. But this and PAYG withholding as well, these are areas where if they go unpaid, the ATO has the power to issue a director's penalty notice. And and convert that liability from being a liability of the company to a personal liability of the directors. And resigning as the director of the company doesn't solve the problem, and it is extraordinarily difficult. Once that liability's come home to roost, it is extraordinarily difficult to avoid that liability. I might, Angela and Cilla, I might leave my presentation component there, but I'm certainly happy to take any questions.
Oh, thank you so much, Amber, because we do have a couple. So are you both okay for time though? Do you have other meetings you've got to get to?
I've got no, I'm good until I've got a 12:30, Angela. So I'm good for another sort of 10-15 minutes. Yep.
Okay, cool. All right, thank you both. Right, I've lost track of the questions. Let me scroll up. No, we covered that one.
I answered a few in the chat just to save some time, just so that we can make sure that all of Amber's questions are able to be answered.
Okay. So I think that might be okay then with the questions, because Cilla answered a couple of those. Sorry, it's hard when it's in the chat rather than the Q&A. Cilla, coming back then, I think Linda had asked a question, what about work cover, back in your presentation, but I don't know, I sort of asked for clarification on that. I didn't see anything pop up. But, oh, sorry. Were you going to say something, Cilla?
No, I was just going to say, no, I couldn't work out what that was. I mean, work cover, Safe Work Australia is the sort of head body. So then the different state-based work cover bodies are also sort of regulating things, but I think we're going to need a bit more detail. Work cover is certainly front and center in terms of policing things in the normal way that they do with respect to work health and safety. But okay. I'm not quite sure what that was going to either.
Okay. And then Samantha said, I suspect there were some savings to, this is for you, Cilla, sorry, yeah. Yep. I suspect there were some savings to employers last year with employees being at home. Are there any, is there any industry data on the sorts of savings, I think?
Yeah, look, to my knowledge there isn't, but it's not to say that the information isn't available. I certainly haven't seen it, but there were absolutely significant savings in terms of productivity, less leave days, savings in terms of the money that you'd ordinarily spend on morning teas, social events, all those kind of things. So there was significant enhancement in terms of profitability of many organisations by having people working from home, no lunches and the like. My cynical old employment lawyer comment was, I think that many organisations would be reluctant to share that information with their staff or others where it's going to be identifiable, because the natural next question from staff will be, well, why don't you pass on those savings to us by way of pay rises and or bonuses, noting that in a situation where you've had those savings, many companies actually, reduced staff salaries or didn't pay bonuses and the like. So it is a very interesting situation where many organisations had a windfall gain of not passing on pay rises and then actually having savings related to their staff. But I haven't seen any industry-based data on that front, and I wouldn't be surprised if we don't see it, because companies just don't want to give the information away.
And I think the cost of offices and property has been a massive concern because companies still do have, the companies who maybe didn't do so well during 2020, they've still got the overheads.
Yes, absolutely. That's the corollary, empty offices.
Okay, Fab, I think we've covered all the questions. I've lost track in there a little bit, but given the time, I guess we'll just sort of wrap it up there. So yeah, thank you so much to both of you for such a wonderful session.